Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza, and today we're going to be talking about a new push in Nevada to rethink traffic enforcement so that a minor violation doesn't end up completely upending people's lives. So in Nevada, like so many other states, drivers can have their licenses suspended if they fail to pay fines and fees associated with low-level traffic violations. Under this law, a fine over a minor traffic ticket can build up and turn into an unpayable debt, which can then lead to a driver's license being suspended. Now, how do you solve that problem? Well, presumably you save up the money to pay that debt back. Only here's the problem. With your license suspended, you can't drive. And if you're in a state like Nevada and you can't drive, you can't get to work. And if you can't get to work, you can't earn the money to pay back the debt that caused your license to be suspended. This is not a problem that is limited to Nevada. I'm giving you an example because we're talking about Nevada today, but I can say as a former public defender who's practiced in 2 different states, this is a problem everywhere. This happens everywhere, that people are losing their licenses to unpaid fines and fees, then losing their ability to work, or having to risk picking up a criminal case because they are driving on a suspended license. Now, who does this impact? Of course, like every aspect of our oppressive criminal legal system, this primarily impacts Black and Brown Americans, who are more likely to be subject to these fines in the first place and also more likely to be pulled over for, you've heard the phrase, driving while Black. So this is on top of the many other negative effects of arrest, including a record, being incarcerated. This is the effect of a minor traffic offense turning into a devastating cycle that only serves to perpetuate prosecution and perpetuate poverty and the inability to work. It feels odd to talk about this topic without mentioning that we are reporting this in the wake of yet another police killing in Minnesota, which again began as a traffic stop. We are reporting this in the wake of yet another video airing of a young Black man in military uniform being subject to a violent traffic stop by police officers, his only offense being driving his new car home. So we are reporting this at a moment in history and in a world where violent police traffic stops against Black and Brown Americans are endemic. But a new law proposed in Nevada would seek to disrupt this cycle that we're talking about by preventing the State Department of Motor Vehicles from suspending licenses based on unpaid fees. Now, the fees would still stand, but that particular punishment of suspending a license would be removed, so that your license, could only be suspended for a serious offense, like driving while intoxicated, something that is related to driving, and not simply for failure to pay a fine. Now, this is not a small problem. This does not affect only a few people. Under the current system, lots of Nevadans lose their licenses because they can't afford to pay traffic fines. A study by the Fines and Fees Justice Center found that between July 2017 and June 2019, more than 38,000 Nevadans had their driver's licenses suspended because they couldn't pay those fines. We're starting to talk about the scale where this impacts the economy. Now, for more on this proposal, it is my pleasure to be joined by Nevada Assemblywoman Cecilia Gonzalez and Lisa Mosley, State Director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
Thank you for having me as well.
Of course. So Assemblywoman, I'd love to start with you. Walk us through what your constituents are experiencing. What is the experience of Nevadans around this sort of low-level traffic enforcement leading to fines and fees, leading to suspension? What are the effects you're seeing? What complaints told you as a lawmaker that reforms were necessary?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think that this is a very important issue, and working on this firsthand, I've really seen the impacts that it has in our community. I think part of this conversation also includes talking about the fact that we still criminalize traffic tickets. And I think that license suspensions and the criminality of a minor traffic offense go hand in hand. And so, I'm not alone. Like you stated, 38,000 Nevadans in a year of 3 years had their license suspensions and were unable to pay their fine. What does that mean exactly? That means that people are unfortunately not able to make their payments. And it's not that they don't want to make their payments, because we know when people have money, they make their payments, right? It's more so a conversation of how this traps folks into the cycle of poverty. I've been there where a few summers ago, I had to pull over while I was driving because I realized that I had missed a payment, and that missed payment automatically put me into warrant status had I not paid it by midnight of that day, right? And so again, it's part of the larger conversation of how we criminalize our non-violent minor traffic offenses, which lead into the police being able to stop us, right? Oftentimes people are forgetful. People have a million things going on as well. And so I think that part of the conversation isn't that they necessarily don't want to pay when they can, right? It's that you forget. And just like I forgot. And so when I've had friends, I've had constituents, people that I know that don't even know that their license has been suspended, right? They're either on a payment plan, they forget to make that one payment, they try to make the payment, and then bam, they're in warrant status, which then they now have to deal with the warrant. And so sometimes, I've even had friends that have been pulled over and again, didn't know that they were in warrant status. And so that has also been when they realize that they're in warrant status when an officer pulls them over. That's also part of the conversation, is who is this impacting the most, which Lisa will be able to talk more about that, but also what areas of town this impacts the most. Again, it's part of this larger conversation, in my opinion, where we really get into and talking about systematic oppression, right? How these systems work to keep people in poverty, to keep them in cycles of poverty. And I think that this is a bill that will really impact everyday hardworking Nevadans. When people have their licenses suspended, they have to make a really tough decision, right? Am I going to continue to go to work? Am I going to continue to make money to put food on the table? Or am I not going to work in fear of getting arrested, in fear of getting pulled over, which then they can lose their job, they can lose whatever small amount of income that they have. And again, Lisa will talk more about where this really impacts our state and who, but these are tough decisions, right? And so, if we were to pass this policy, people would no longer be in fear of having their license suspended. They would no longer be in fear of being arrested because they were unable to pay a fine or a fee. Again, like you stated, the fees are still in place. You will still have to pay your fee. This is just taking away this really punitive practice that we still have in our state on, honestly, low-income poor people, in my opinion.
Assemblywoman, I'm going to go to Lisa in a second to ask her about the sort of the scale of impact here. But before I do, I wanted to pick up on something you just said about forgetting to pay. Because I know that AB 434 introduced ability to pay assessments, so the court would have to consider if someone was unable to pay, and provide alternatives like community service, which, if we're being real, takes you out of your job, just like not being able to drive to your job does. But I wanted to just ask you, it sounds like that doesn't go far enough, because there's this whole other category of ordinary Nevadans who just forget. I mean, are there other reasons why AB 434 doesn't go far enough?
That's a great question. AB 434, I think, was worked on last session, and I think that I wasn't here last session, so I can't really speak to the conversations, but from my understanding, it's for the court to address someone's ability to pay and offer community service. And I would agree. I think that community service, while it's a great alternative, if you aren't able to pay, it is still a barrier, right? You're talking about people who may be juggling 2 jobs, right? And I think from my personal experience, I've been there where I'm either, juggling 2 jobs and school and trying to figure out when I can go and do my community service hours. I've been that person who needed a payment plan, and then it actually added on more money when I selected to do a payment plan option, right? And so it really is barriers that I think prevent us from getting at our ability to pay, right? And then you have if you pay over the phone, you pay another fine or a fee, right? And so it racks up at the end of the day. And these are people that are just trying to make ends meet every single day. I think maybe Lisa can speak more to that bill.
Let's go to Lisa also on when we talk about, who are we talking about? I mean, what do the data show about who is being hurt the most by the current scheme? Lisa, let's get your take.
Well, thank you for the question, Emily. It's no surprise that when we talk about fines and fees, we talk about driver's license suspensions, that it affects mostly Black and Brown communities. These are some of the communities that are the most policed and receive the most citations. Here we have a publication called the Review Journal, and a few years ago, the Review Journal did a study on fines and fees and driver license suspensions and warrants, and found that there were 7 zip codes, mostly Black and brown, statistically Black and brown zip codes, that were the most policed, that were receiving the most citations, and of course, the most driver license suspensions. So, that shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us.
So you mentioned the communities that are the most policed. It's really, really hard in a half-hour show to sum up like all the ways in which all of these different levels of racism and oppression and systems sort of interplay to create a huge negative impact on Black and brown communities. But I'm wondering if you can kind of talk us through the pipeline, right? Like what neighborhood means, what the style of policing means, what these license suspensions mean for people's futures if they are living in Nevada in a Black and brown community.
Well, what it does is it traps people, as the Assemblywoman mentioned, and as you mentioned, it traps people in a cycle of poverty. We're talking about minor traffic violations for things like driving on an expired registration. A simple ticket for that could end up costing someone up to $1,000, if not more. A simple ticket for driving with expired registration might be $100. And in these particular communities, Black and brown, often poor and working class communities, that $100 ticket could be a lot of money. And so we do have the option of getting on payment plans, which is wonderful. There are collection mechanisms in place. But what happens is when someone's on a payment plan, let's just say you missed that payment. And so you miss your payment, and now you are subject to additional fines and fees on top of that. And so it spirals, and it just builds and it builds and it builds. And someone could end up being in debt for over $1,000 for a simple ticket that has nothing to do with public safety, that doesn't have anything to do with dangerous driving. So it just ends up trapping people in a cycle of poverty.
Yeah, I want to speak a little bit to that too. I'm just thinking about my experience with traffic tickets. And as a young woman driver, I haven't been the best driver, right? I haven't. And I had to learn how to be a better driver. And so, there was a period of time in my life in my early 20s where I was getting, a couple citations a year, right? Nothing crazy, nothing, I wasn't getting in car accidents, but I just had that experience, and anyone can go and look at my record. I think that's public information. But in my early 20s, I'm in college, I'm working 2 jobs, right? I remember in particular, I had I think I went to community service twice, but I had 2 different tickets, I think, and it took me, I think, like over 2 years to pay them because I needed to be on a payment plan, and then I wanted to do the community service option. And even though there is a community service option, it doesn't entirely just take away the ticket, right? Like you still have a fee of some sort to pay. You still have to take time off. So even though I was able to do community service, I'm now losing a day or 2 of work, right? Or a day or 2 of school that I had to do. And I don't have a family. I'm not a mother, right? And so when you think of people who have families that need to put food on the table, it really is another barrier. I think a lot of times people like to say, oh, well, you could just do community service, right? But that's not always the easiest answer as well. And then again, as Lisa gave the example, being on a payment plan does cost more money in the long term. So not only are you penalized for needing a payment plan, right? We're literally penalizing people for needing time to pay a small fine, which, for working class families can really be the difference of food for the week, of healthcare, right? Like these are real life examples of how this impacts real people.
So, Assemblywoman, when I think of things over in my little world, I would like the people who I don't know, I'm going to try to name a Las Vegas casino, own the Mirage. Is that one? Whoever is making a lot of money owning these big places, I want them to pay their fines and fees. That's great. They can totally pay. But for someone who's working 2 jobs, I want them at their jobs. For someone who's in school, I want them at school. For a mom who needs to be with their kids, I want her with her kids. But maybe I'm an outlier. So can you tell me, where does AB 151 stand right now? Who supports it? Who opposes it? What groups are speaking out on it? And what's the plan?
That's a great question. I met Lisa late last year to talk about this amazing policy, and I really started to learn that this has been a conversation for over the last decade on the ground with folks like the Black Caucus, with organizations like the Mass Liberation Project and PLAN, which is the Progressive Alliance of Nevada, Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada. And so this isn't a new conversation. And people have been doing the work on this on the ground for years. And I have just been really excited to join that fight. And currently, as it stands, AB 151 passed out of committee. I believe it was everybody voted for it except for one Republican legislator, because again, there's this conversation, or there's this idea that we are taking away this punitive aspect of folks committing traffic infractions, right? Which is not true. Like I said, the bill still has to pay that fine. After we voted it out of committee, it was on the floor for a second reading. So in the state of Nevada, you have to have bills read 3 times before you're able to vote them out of the floor and onto the Senate. Because there is a fiscal impact to this bill, it is now Ways and Means. And that means any bill that either creates money or costs money or loses money goes into a committee, which is called Ways and Means, or most folks refer to it as the Money Committee. And so that is where we'll have to present the bill again and talk with the DMV, really, to talk about how we can either mitigate the fiscal impact and or how we can really work out this fiscal impact. And so then from there, it would go back, depending on what happens, it would go back to the floor and vote it out and onto the Senate.
So I have a totally random question for you. There's no reason you should be thinking about this, but I just learned that in most of Scandinavia, I know in Finland, they actually scale traffic tickets by income. So that if you are like a billionaire, you might have to pay an extremely expensive traffic ticket because it's a percentage of your income. But if you have no income, your tickets are free. Is there any discussion of that sort of scaling to offset the fiscal impact of this?
Ooh, that's a great question. I'm going to throw that question to Lisa. Like I said, she's been doing the work on this for a very long time.
Well, here in Nevada, each jurisdiction pretty much has their own fee schedule. There hasn't been any talk of, say, scaling those fees or the fines that come with traffic tickets. It's a great question, and it possibly is something that we might look at in the future. I mean, that's a great example of what they're doing over in those other countries where they're scaling it. And here, if someone has money, if, like you talked about, maybe an owner of a casino or just someone who's in a more affluent zip code, they could just walk in, they get a ticket, and they just pay it, and they're done with it. But we're talking about people who don't have the ability to do that. We're talking about people who, as I said before, a $100 ticket could spiral and end up being much more money than they can actually pay. And so, yes, we haven't talked about that scaling fines here, but it's possibly something that could come in the future.
So, Lisa, I want to drill down with you on what the future holds. You brought up the future. You've opened the door. And I really can't shake, the moment we're in, which I mentioned at the top, which is a moment when, for some people, a traffic stop is just, I get a ticket, I pay the fee, I'm good, I'm done. For some people, a traffic stop can be lethal.
Yes. And
even if it's not lethal, one has to experience it with the fear of it being lethal. I mean, that experience alone, I just feel like there's an actual physical danger and lethality to armed police traffic stops. And there's also an experiential trauma to armed police traffic stops that is not being talked about very much in this very, very practical conversation, which is wonderful and meritorious about sort of economic impact of these rules. But I'm wondering if you could talk to me about, like, what does this mean? Does this open the door to more broad change when it comes to how we engage with low-level traffic enforcement? Do police need to be involved here? Should this be something with such a huge impact?
So, Emily, you bring up a great question, and it's a part of the conversation that we rarely ever talk about. For someone who can just walk in or just get on the phone or just send in a credit card and make their payment and be done with it, there is no stress there. But this is a very stressful topic. This is a very stressful policy. So for someone who gets a minor traffic ticket for a minor infraction that has nothing to do with the safety of driving, that could send them not only to an economic downfall, but also emotionally and physically. The fear of driving on a suspended license. I mean, let's face it, someone gets their license suspended. It is an impossible choice. Do I continue to drive and be able to go to work, get my children to the doctor, get my children to school, or do I not drive and risk losing my job and not being able to take care of my family? And sometimes people make the choice of driving anyway. But can you imagine the stress of looking in the mirror and seeing a police officer behind you. And are they going to run my plate? Are they going to pull me over and possibly arrest me and take me to jail? That's a very real fear. And these are low-level traffic violations. And so eventually we'd love to see a system where if it's a minor traffic violation, that people don't get pulled over. A license plate is maybe noted, and maybe, they'll get a notice in the mail to say, maybe you need to pay this ticket. But just some kind of system where maybe we don't need the interaction with police for something like a minor traffic violation. I mean, one of the important reasons for this kind of legislation is to help bring an end to those potential violent traffic stops by police officers for something so minor as driving with a suspended or expired registration, or driving with an air freshener or something hanging. This is part of that conversation, and we would love to see that happen.
Assemblywoman, we'll close with you. I'd love for you to comment on what Lisa just raised. I mean, are there better ways of doing this that go beyond not suspending a license and into perhaps no police contact ticketing, or civilians filling in for police when it comes to low-level traffic enforcement, as we've seen in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, I think that is part of the conversation, right? It's not just about having a suspended license. It's everything that Lisa talked about. It's the overall conversation about how this plays into systematic oppression, and how we have seen again and again, simple traffic infractions have led to it being lethal. And I know from, in my experience, when I get pulled over, there is that physical traumatic reaction knowing that I am a person of color being pulled over by the police, right? And so I empathize with communities that also feel that way, that have had histories of police targeting and over policing our communities. So I think it's definitely part of the larger conversation. I know, for example, in California, if you run a red light, right, you get your plate taken, and then you get the ticket in the mail, right? And so I think that these are all parts of conversations that are part of the larger conversation on what it really means, what community policing really means, and how we move from this time that we're in. I don't know if I have the answers. I think it's, way more than anything we have time for today, right? When we talk about the history of policing in our communities.
Assemblywoman and Ms. Mosley, thank you so much for being here on the Appeal Live to talk about this really important issue. And I wish you both the best of luck in fixing this issue and moving on to some of the new challenges we talked about at the show. I'd love to hear back from you on what happens next.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having us. And I just wanted to put it out there, I really am committed to this issue. And if it's not something that we are successful this session, you better believe Lisa and I will be back here next session and the sessions after.
We will look forward to having you on the show to talk about it then as well.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you. I fully expect it to pass, though.
Agreed.
Well, we just heard about 38,000 Nevadans are experiencing this thing that Lisa Mosley and Assemblywoman Gonzalez just came on here to tell us about, which is you get a traffic ticket, you get a fine from that ticket, you forget to pay it, or you can't pay it because you're living paycheck to paycheck. And guess what? Your license is suspended. And that means you either stop driving and don't make it to work and lose any money you would have to pay back that fine, or you risk arrest. You risk getting stopped by police. You risk armed police contact in a world where we are poignantly aware today, as every day, that contact can be lethal. This is something that is destroying the economic mobility and community potential of Black and Brown people in Nevada, and to be honest, in states across the country where this is very much a reality, a mechanism of endless criminalization of poverty, creating a pipeline from the highway straight into America's nearly 3,000 jails. But we are at a moment where it seems like people are open to new ideas and where constituents are hungry for change. Assemblywoman Gonzalez walked us through what the process will look like for that change in Nevada. Ms. Mosley mentioned that she is expecting this bill to pass, which would at the very least end the ability to suspend people's licenses and thereby take away their ability to work on the basis of an unpaid fine or fee. Does this crack open the door to more changes? Perhaps non-police low-level traffic enforcement, perhaps automated ticketing the way you have in California, so there is not that risk of a lethal encounter for an air freshener around the window? Maybe. We will wait to see what happens next in Nevada, but as always, you caught it here first on the Appeal Live We look forward to seeing you again soon. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.